Do you feel the war in Afghanistan should be taught more in school?
Most definitely. I think that many of events that are happening, in our times and within the last 10 to 20 years are not really talked about. We spend so much time studying things that happened thousands or hundreds of years ago. I think we need to invest more time into what's happening now.
Why do you think today's kids in school know barely anything about the war in Afghanistan?
Two reasons. It's not addressed in schools. We don't really talk about what's happening. So they're not, or I think students aren't getting any of that knowledge divulged to them by their teachers and in their curriculum. And the second reason why I think they know very little is because our media is so misconstrued. I think that our media, unfortunately, doesn't really tell us about what's happening. It's an ongoing war. It's now 10 years into it, or more. We're almost 11 years into this war, and our media chooses when to report on it. So it kind of pops up here and there sporadically throughout each year, and I think that our kids are misinformed because the media is not giving us a very accurate tale, and it's not talked about in schools.
What do you think high school students should know about the war in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that the most important thing that people should know about that war is where Afghanistan is. I think they should know where it is. They should know a little bit about its culture and its history. In order to understand the Afghanistan war, I think you really have to understand what the war on terrorism is, when it began. You have to understand the history of Afghanistan as a nation, as a culture, as a group. It's a history that goes back thousands of years. The Russians were involved in Afghanistan for a long period of time, in the 70s and 80s. That's something most people don't know about. Afghanistan, in many ways, is kind of lines drawn in sand. Colonial powers have created it into a nation, and it's a mixture of different cultures. So I think that students really need to have kind of a background on where this place is and what it's made of, who are the people there. So if we know more about who the people are, where it's at, and a little bit of its history, I think we'd better understand it.
Who is to blame for the lack of knowledge that high schoolers have about the war in Afghanistan?
There are a lot of parties to blame. I would blame our own government for number one, because our own government does not do a justifiable job in telling us about the war. Our media is also colluding with our government and really not giving us the full picture of why we're there, why we went. I would also argue that we as teachers need to step it up. Our curriculum that's designed for us to teach doesn't give us the freedom or the room to talk about it. So the textbook materials, the curriculum materials are not there. I think it's the job of teachers to invite students to be curious and learn more about it. So I think all parties, I think parents need to talk to their kids about it. The media needs to do a better job covering it, and in schools we need to talk about it too.
Do you believe the war in Afghanistan is ignored by the public due to the lack of media attention?
Definitely. I think that the majority of Americans, whether they get their news sources from TV or internet or radio, the majority of Americans are very misinformed. Most Americans will not choose to go out and find information. They're very passive. They receive it. And so when we're a passive society that sits back and allows the media to tell us what's going on and tell us what to think, then that's destructive. And I think that we are very misinformed about what's happening there. And there's so much news coming out of that region, it's hard for the average person to really put the pieces together of what's happening and why.
Do you feel it is necessary that the United States is in Afghanistan fighting a war?
Absolutely not. From my own personal perspective, I do not support war in any way whatsoever. I don't think there's anything as a justifiable war. I support armed forces. I support our troops. They're doing a job. They're doing what they're told, and I think they're very important people, and I'm proud of them. But at the same time, I'm not proud of a government who makes war against a poor country. I think some of the reasons for us going into the war initially were presented to the American people in a way that was justifiable at first, and many people saw it as justifiable, and now it's gotten to a point where nobody really knows why we're there. I don't agree with it. I never agreed with the initial invasion, and I still don't agree with our occupation there.
Why did the war in Afghanistan start?
Well, the lie that was sold to us by our government and our media in 2002 was that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, these terrorist organizations that were responsible for the September 11th attacks, have been hiding out in the Afghan deserts and using Afghanistan as a base for their operations. The lie, like I said, that was sold to us was that we were going to go there and root out these terrorist cells, these terrorist organizations. It's been 10 years now, and it's pretty absurd to me to think that the largest, most powerful, technologically advanced military in the world cannot take down a couple of, terrorist cells in the desert. So I think that I really believe, and I know that a lot of politicians and people have brought this up, I think Afghanistan is the new Vietnam. Vietnam was an occupation of a foreign country, a poor foreign country, I will remind you, that lasted for far too long. And our real goal in Vietnam was not to win; it was to spend money and to find a way to make our military budgets bigger. And I think that the war in Afghanistan has allowed that to happen. So I really do believe that it was started with this lie that was sold to us that we were going to go and defeat terrorism. But anybody who's educated and has studied the history of war will tell you you can't destroy terrorism with terrorism. I would say that the American government is acting as terrorists. And for anyone studying the Afghan war, I would ask, let's not just look at how many Americans have died in this conflict, but what kind of effect has it had on the Afghan people.